Hi, I'm Dr. Alexandrina Vanke. In this video, I'm going to talk about mental mapping as a creative research method. I will discuss what mental mapping is, then how to integrate mental maps in qualitative research, and finally, I will explain how to analyze mental maps. But let's start with the definition. So a mental map is a visualization of a person's subjective perception of the area where they live or work, or the area which they visit often or from time to time. Mental mapping as a research method was used and developed by urban planner, architect, and researcher Kevin Lynch. In his book, The Image of the City and Its Elements, Lynch explains that any given city has its public image, which is composed by many individual images. And these individual images overlap each other, and at the same time, they are unique. Lynch used mental mapping in the study of the visual landscape of the US cities. And he came to the conclusion that the content of the city images have some typical elements, which are paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks. So paths are the channels along which a city dweller moves. For instance, it can be streets, railroads, or roads, or canals. Then edges, which are the linear elements. So edges are boundaries between two phases, two parts in the city. And they may be shores, railroad carts, or walls. Then Lynch distinguished districts, which are urban areas of a small, medium, or large size, and they have boundaries. So it means that when an observer comes to a district, they perceive themselves as inside the district, this area, or outside of the district when they are outside of them. And each district has its particular traits and characteristics, and they often bear territorial identities. Then Lynch writes about nodes, which are points where we make decisions where to go. It can be crossroads, it can be convergence of paths, junctions. So the places where we have many possibilities to choose where to go, which route to choose, and what to explore in the city. And finally, landmarks, which are external to the observer, to a city dweller. So landmarks are such kind of objects as high buildings, monuments, signs, mountains. So everything which help us to orient within the city space. And these landmarks are often clues of identities, and they structure the image of the city. And now I'm turning to the second question of how to integrate mental maps in qualitative research. In 1950s, Lynch explored the visual landscape of Boston and some other US cities. And he integrated a request to depict Boston in interview. And he asked his research participants to complete the following task, which was formulated as follows. We would like you to make a quick map of central Boston, inwards or downtown from Massachusetts Avenue. Make it just as if you were making a rapid description of the city to a stranger, covering all the main features. We don't expect an accurate drawing, just a rough sketch. And an interviewer should make notes of what a person, a research participant draws. I can give you an example of how to integrate mental mapping in creative ethnography, drawing on my own research practice. I used mental maps in my doctoral project, which looked at working class life and struggle in post-Soviet Russia. I used an approach of multi-sited ethnography, which implies a selection of several field sites. And I collected data in the capital of Moscow and in the regional city of Yekaterinburg, which are post-industrial cities. And within these two cities, I selected two industrial neighborhoods. So I interviewed the residents of these two industrial neighborhoods, and I asked them to draw the neighborhood where they lived as part of the interview. But I asked them to complete this task in the end of the interview, after we discussed their lived experiences, their feelings towards their neighborhood, their biographical background, and some other issues which were related to everyday life in the place which I studied. And I formulated this creative task as follows. Please draw the name of the neighborhood as you imagined it. And after my research participant completed this task, I asked them to explain what they drew verbally. And this explanation was really helpful at the stage of the data analysis. However, in my research, mental maps were complementary to mainstream qualitative research methods, such as interviews and ethnographic observations. And I combined mental maps with these qualitative research methods. And I also used one more projective technique, creative method, which is called a drawing of society. But how can we analyze mental maps? I will explain you how to analyze drawings of the neighborhoods or the city space, drawing on my own experience and drawing on my research article, which was published in the Sociological Review journal, Coexisting Structures of Feeling, Senses and Imaginaries of Industrial Neighborhoods. In this article, I explain how to build a complex strategy of multisensory data analysis, including mental maps. And what I did after I completed my fieldwork in two field sites, in two industrial neighborhoods located in the cities of Moscow and Yekaterinburg. And I call these neighborhoods the Moscow neighborhood and the Yekaterinburg neighborhood to anonymize them. So after the completion of fieldwork, I started looking at these images. And I tried to find some similarities, some patterns, and I realized that in the Yekaterinburg neighborhood, my research participants tended to depict the main plant, which is located in the neighborhood, and it was built in the early Soviet era, and it is still functioning plant, even though it is undergoing deindustrialization. So I realized that industrial elements were dominating. were dominant. In the Moscow neighborhood, I found a similar pattern of depicting industrial elements, an industrial structure feeling. And in the Moscow neighborhood, it was not factories or plants, but even though they were depicted, but the most frequent element was a railway line. Because the residents of the Moscow neighborhood used to use this railway line to get to the plant where most workers used to work in the Soviet era. And when I started looking closer at these images, I realized that I can classify them in 3 types. First, I selected drawings which contained maps. Then I selected drawings which contained symbols. And then I selected the mental maps, which contained both symbols and maps. Then I tried to estimate the frequency of the most typical elements. So you can count how many times the element of such elements as plant or a rail way line was depicted by research participants, or probably it can be roads or the most important buildings in your area. So something which is most significant for residents or for people who live in the area or visit it often, it will be depicted most often. Then I coded my interview transcripts and my field notes, which also contained the description of the visual landscape, the urban areas which I studied. And of course, the interview transcripts contained verbal explanations of drawings which my research participants made. So I coded all verbal information thematically. I used NViva software for qualitative data analysis because I had more than 50 interviews. But if you don't have so many interviews, you can code your interview transcripts manually. So you can code verbal explanations of drawings manually and generate codes. Some codes which are important for understanding the meanings of the mental maps which you collected. So I coded all verbal and textual information, all textual data, and I generated 2 categories which were important for me and for my research participants, which are senses. People talk about senses when they were drawing these mental maps. And as a researcher, I generated for myself and for theorization the category of imaginary. So I generated 2 codes, and these codes were grounded empirically, drawing on my empirical data, and they were grounded theoretically, drawing on my understanding and knowledge of research literature on urban imaginaries and a sense of place. And finally, I combined interpretations of verbal explanations of drawings and some codes which I generated as senses and imaginaries. And I combined it with visual and metaphor interpretations of drawings. So drawings contained some visual metaphors because a plant which depicted in the drawing, it is a metaphor of the industrial past, the Soviet past, and I tried to interpret this together with the the contextual information which I observed by doing participant observation of these areas. And finally, I reconstructed the concept of structure of feeling, which was introduced by sociologist Raymond Williams, and you can also read about it in my journal article. So you can use mental maps either for empirical, practical purposes, or you can use these mental maps for theorization of concepts, for the analysis of a sense of place, for the analysis of a local structure of feeling in a particular neighborhood or in a particular city. And you can reconstruct or visualize emotions, feelings, some effective attachment, a kind of effective attachment to place with the help of this mental mapping technique. And as I already explained, you will produce a more rigorous analysis if you will combine mental maps, a creative method of data collection, together with some classical methods of qualitative research, such as interview or participant or non-participant observation. But at the same time, you can use only mental maps if you would like to make an arts-based research or just creative research. And it also can be enough to produce some interpretations, some explanations of how people perceive and view the city. I hope that you found this information helpful. And if you'd like to know more about mental mapping, you can read the book by Kevin Lynch, and you can read my journal article, Coexisting Structures of Feeling, Senses and Imaginaries of Industrial Neighborhoods, in the Sociological Review journal. Thank you so much for your attention.